They were trusted. Not just admired, trusted. Invited into homes, hospitals, schools, and national memory. Their faces became comfortable. Their voices became routine. Their presence felt safe because it was familiar. And for decades, Britain never questioned that feeling. That was the mistake. Because behind the applause, behind the laughter tracks and standing ovations, another history was unfolding quietly. One that didn't make it into biographies or retrospectives. One that wasn't celebrated, archived, or taught. A history of secrets protected by silence, crimes softened by fame, and reputations so powerful they bent institutions around them. This is not a story about rumors. This is a story about what happens when a celebrity becomes a shield. For years, the British entertainment industry operated on an unspoken belief. If someone was beloved enough, they were untouchable. If they were eccentric, they were harmless. If they were knighted, they were beyond question. And if accusations surfaced, they were inconvenient, not urgent. That belief didn't just fail, it destroyed lives. Because while the public clapped, some of these men were doing things that would later make even hardened investigators struggle to read the files. And when whispers emerged, they were dismissed as misunderstandings, exaggerations, or bitterness. Careers were protected, legacies were preserved, victims were ignored. Until time ran out. In some cases, justice came late. In others, it never came at all. And in the worst cases, it only arrived after death made denial impossible. This list isn't comfortable, it isn't nostalgic, and it isn't designed to reassure you, it's designed to unsettle you. Because these weren't fringe figures, they weren't outsiders, they were the faces of British culture itself. Men whose work shaped generations. Men whose scandals forced the country to ask a question it avoided for far too long. What if the danger wasn't hidden at all? What if it was protected? As we count down these 17 figures, you'll notice something disturbing. The crimes are different. The eras change. The circumstances vary. But the pattern doesn't. Power delays consequences. Fame dilutes outrage. And institutions hesitate when reputations are at stake. Some of these men were convicted. Some were acquitted. Some were never charged. And some were exposed only when they could no longer defend themselves. But every name on this list represents a collapse, not just of a career, but of trust. And number 3 doesn't shock because it's violent. It shocks because it proves how easily redemption stories can be weaponized, and how eagerly the public accepts them. So before you assume this is just another list of fallen stars, understand this. This is a record of who was protected, who was believed, and who paid the price for silence. Welcome to the list they hoped history would soften. It didn't. Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile did not rise to power quietly. He rose loudly, bizarrely, and in full view of the nation. That's what makes his story so disturbing. He didn't hide in the shadows. He didn't blend in. He stood out so aggressively that people mistook visibility for transparency. The cigars, the tracksuits, the heavy gold chains, the deliberately crude jokes delivered with a wink that suggested everything was ironic, everything was performance.
Well, actually, again, I was walking down a corridor, this time at the BBC,
Right.
and a man said,
Savile cultivated the image of a man so odd he couldn't possibly be dangerous. It worked. For decades, Savile was treated less like a presenter and more like a fixture of British life. He wasn't just on television, he was woven into institutions. He moved freely through BBC studios, hospitals, care homes, schools, and prisons. He was granted access that no background check could justify and no internal policy seemed to restrain. In some hospitals, he was given his own set of keys. Not symbolic keys, real ones. Keys that allowed him to come and go without supervision, explanation, or accountability. And nobody stopped him. Savile's power didn't come from intimidation, it came from usefulness. He raised millions for charity. He volunteered constantly. He showed up when institutions needed good publicity. And in return, those institutions stopped asking questions. When complaints surfaced, they were reframed as misunderstandings. When staff felt uncomfortable, they were encouraged to interpret discomfort as eccentricity. Savile knew exactly how far he could push boundaries, and he pushed them slowly, deliberately, always testing how much silence he could buy with generosity and fame. The most chilling part is how often the warning signs were visible. Colleagues joked about him being inappropriate. Rumors circulated for years in corridors, green rooms, and pubs. Some were reported, many were dismissed. Files were misplaced. Complaints were downgraded. Concerns were never escalated. The system didn't just fail to stop him, it actively absorbed the risk. Savile understood institutions better than the institutions understood themselves. He knew that once you become indispensable, scrutiny becomes inconvenient. Once you generate positive headlines, negative ones feel disruptive. Once you're seen as a national treasure, accusations feel almost disrespectful. And Savile leaned into that status with precision. He bragged openly. He said things that should have set off alarms. He told jokes that weren't jokes. He hid nothing because he didn't need to. When he died in 2011, the reaction was predictable. Wall-to-wall tributes, honorific language, memorials, programs celebrating his life and career. He was eulogized as a tireless fundraiser, a misunderstood oddball, a uniquely British character. And then, quietly at first, the truth began to surface. Not rumors, evidence, police investigations, independent inquiries, survivor testimony, hundreds of accounts, spanning decades, institutions, and age groups. The scale was staggering. Over 450 victims were formally identified. And investigators made it clear. This number reflected reporting, not reality. The actual total would likely never be known. What followed wasn't just outrage, it was a national shock. Because Savile hadn't fooled one organization. He had moved effortlessly between many. The BBC, hospitals, charities, political circles, each assumed someone else was responsible. Each trusted that oversight existed elsewhere. In reality, there was no oversight, just reputation. The BBC launched internal investigations that read less like audits and more like postmortems. Pages of missed opportunities. Emails that went nowhere. Complaints handled informally, then forgotten. A culture where raising concerns about a powerful figure was quietly discouraged. Savile's image was dismantled almost overnight. Statues removed, programs pulled, his name erased from honors lists. But none of that helped the people he had already harmed. There was no trial, no sentence, no confrontation in a courtroom. Savile died a free man, buried with honors he never deserved. Today, he represents more than individual evil. He represents what happens when systems confuse fame with safety and charity with character. He is a permanent stain on British institutional history, proof that harm doesn't always hide. Sometimes it smiles, fundraises, and gets invited back. And his case leaves behind a question that refuses to fade. If someone this visible could operate for this long, how many others benefited from the same silence? Robert Hughes. Robert Hughes was not a monster people expected to unmask. That's what made his fall so disturbing. He wasn't loud. He wasn't strange. He wasn't wrapped in controversy or chaos. He was familiar, comfortable, safe. On screen, Hughes played the role millions trusted without question, the dependable father figure. In Hey Dad, one of Australia's most popular sitcoms of the late 1980s and early 1990s, he embodied warmth, authority, and domestic stability. Families watched him together. Children grew up with his character as a constant presence in their homes. Parents didn't just approve of him, they identified with him. That image wasn't incidental. It was the foundation of his power. Behind the scenes, however, a very different reality was unfolding. One that didn't fit the laugh track. One that relied not on eccentricity or intimidation, but on trust. The kind of trust that exists when adults stop watching closely because nothing feels wrong. For years, Hughes operated in spaces where boundaries were assumed rather than enforced. Young performers, closed sets, authority structures that placed him at the top. And when allegations eventually surfaced, they didn't emerge as a single accusation. They arrived in fragments, then patterns, then testimony that could no longer be ignored. By the early 2010s, the facade began to crack. Former child actors came forward. Accounts overlapped, details aligned, and this time, the system didn't manage to look away. Unlike Jimmy Savile, Hughes faced justice while alive. In 2014, after a long and emotionally draining trial, Hughes was convicted in Australia of multiple counts of child sexual and indecent assault. The court found the abuse was not isolated or accidental, it was sustained, repeated, and rooted in a deliberate misuse of power. The sentencing judge emphasized not just the harm done, but the betrayal of trust, a betrayal magnified by Hughes's public role as a symbol of family safety. He was sentenced to more than a decade in prison. The verdict didn't just dismantle a man, it erased a cultural memory. Hey Dad, once a staple of family television, was pulled from syndication almost overnight. His image was blurred out in reruns. His name was quietly removed from celebratory histories of television. It was as if the industry tried to cauterize the wound by pretending the show had never existed. But erasure doesn't heal damage. What made Hughes's case particularly instructive was how many people later admitted they had sensed something was wrong. Former cast members spoke of discomfort, of behavior that felt inappropriate even at the time. But like so many stories before and after, those feelings were dismissed internally. Too risky to confront, too easy to rationalize. Because Hughes didn't look dangerous. That's the most unsettling lesson of his downfall. Predators don't always hide behind spectacle. Sometimes they hide behind normality, behind roles designed to reassure, behind the assumption that people who make us feel safe must be safe themselves. Even after conviction, Hughes continued to deny wrongdoing publicly. Appeals were attempted, statements were issued. But by then, denial didn't matter. The damage was already permanent, not just to his career, but to the lives he impacted, and to the illusion that familiarity equals safety. His case didn't spark the same national reckoning as Savile's, but it didn't need to, because it confirmed something far more disturbing. You don't need an entire system to fail for abuse to thrive. You only need silence and trust. Leslie Grantham. Leslie Grantham didn't fall from grace after fame. He arrived at fame already carrying a conviction most people never come back from, and somehow, Britain welcomed him anyway. Before the nation knew him as Dirty Den Watts, the sneering, manipulative landlord who helped define EastEnders, Grantham had already lived a life that ended with a body on the ground. In 1966, at just 19 years old, while serving in the British Army in Germany, Grantham attempted to rob a taxi driver. What followed wasn't a scuffle exaggerated by tabloids or a charge softened by legal language. It was a struggle, a gunshot, and a man dead at the scene. Grantham was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. The sentence was life imprisonment. For most people, that would be the end of the story, not just a career, but any chance at public redemption. But prison didn't close Grantham's narrative. I redirected it. While incarcerated, he joined a drama program. Acting became not just a skill, but an escape route. When he was released on parole after serving 10 years, he didn't return quietly to obscurity. He enrolled in drama school. He auditioned. He worked. Slowly at first, then steadily. And then something extraordinary happened. British television didn't just cast him, it embraced him. By the mid-1980s, Grantham was one of the most recognizable faces in the country. EastEnders didn't hide his past, it leaned into it. A real-life killer playing a fictional villain felt edgy, honest, almost poetic. The audience were fascinated. The irony was intoxicating. Viewers watched Dirty Den scheme, betray, and manipulate, knowing the man behind the character had once crossed a far more serious line. For a while, that knowledge felt like proof of rehabilitation. But redemption stories are fragile. They rely on restraint, humility, and distance from scandal. And Grantham's second act didn't stay clean for long. In the early 2000s, while filming abroad, Grantham was caught in a tabloid sting involving an explicit webcam incident. There were no criminal charges this time, but the fallout was brutal. The footage exploded across headlines. The man once forgiven for murder was now being publicly humiliated for something far less severe, yet culturally intolerable. His career collapsed again. Contracts vanished. Roles dried up. Public sympathy evaporated. For many viewers, this wasn't just embarrassment. It reopened the unresolved question they'd never fully answered. Had Grantham truly earned redemption? Or had the country simply grown comfortable with the idea of it? That's what makes his story so unsettling. He served his sentence. He followed the legal path back. He rebuilt a career honestly. And yet, something about the arc still feels wrong. Not because the law failed, but because the public never decided what forgiveness was supposed to look like. Grantham became a symbol of moral confusion, a man who had paid his debt, yet never escaped his shadow. A reminder that while the justice system can issue release dates, society never fully agrees on absolution. Some saw him as proof that people can change. Others saw him as proof that we sometimes confuse charisma with rehabilitation, and the most uncomfortable truth sits between those two positions. Grantham didn't hide who he was. He didn't deny his past. He didn't pretend the murder never happened. Britain knew and still chose to watch. That's why number 3 shocks people. Not because of the crime, but because of the acceptance, because it forces a question that cuts deeper than scandal. How much are we willing to forgive, if the performance is good enough? Chris Langham. Chris Langham was never supposed to be on a list like this. He didn't trade in shock or spectacle. He didn't build a career on controversy, excess, or notoriety. His power came from something far more trusted: intelligence. Langham was the kind of figure British television respected instinctively. A writer, a satirist, a man associated with sharp dialogue, political insight, and cultural credibility. His work helped shape some of the most influential British comedies of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Shows like Not the 9 O'Clock News and The Thick of It weren't just popular, they were seen as smart, incisive, and morally alert. Langham wasn't a clown. He was part of the intellectual backbone of British satire. That reputation mattered. Because when someone like Langham is accused, the instinct isn't outrage. It's disbelief. In 2007, that disbelief collapsed. Langham was arrested and later convicted for downloading illegal images involving minors. The case didn't hinge on rumor or implication. The material was found. The charges were clear. And in court, Langham admitted to possession, claiming the images were gathered for research connected to a potential acting role. The court rejected that explanation. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison and placed on the sex offenders register. Just like that, a career built on credibility disintegrated. Projects were cancelled. His name was removed from credits. His past work quietly disappeared from schedules and retrospectives, not with public announcements, but with the industry's preferred method of erasure: silence. What made Langham's fall so disturbing wasn't just the crime, it was how normal everything around him had seemed. He wasn't chaotic, he wasn't erratic, he wasn't publicly spiraling. He was articulate, composed, embedded deeply within the cultural establishment. The very qualities that made him feel trustworthy also made him invisible to suspicion. Colleagues described shock, confusion, disbelief. Many said they never saw it coming, and that reaction reveals something uncomfortable. We tend to associate danger with disorder. Langham represented the opposite. His case shattered the assumption that intelligence equals integrity, that refinement equals safety, that people who critique power and hypocrisy are immune to becoming the very thing they analyze. After serving his sentence, Langham attempted to re-enter public life. Not with fanfare, but quietly. Small projects, occasional interviews, carefully framed apologies. But British television didn't welcome him back. There was no redemption arc, no second act. The line was drawn, and unusually, it held. Unlike some figures who faded and later resurfaced, Langham remained largely excluded. Not through protest or outrage, but through consensus. The industry decided, without saying it out loud, that some violations sever trust permanently. His story lingers as one of the most unsettling examples on this list because it forces a shift in perspective. Not all harm comes from obvious villains. Not all danger announces itself loudly. And not all predators look reckless or broken. Sometimes they look competent. Sometimes they sound persuasive. Sometimes they sit in writers' rooms shaping narratives about morality itself. Langham didn't just fall from grace. He collapsed the illusion that respectability is protection against darkness. Freddy Star. Freddy Star built his career on chaos. Loud, unpredictable, and deliberately outrageous, Star was the kind of entertainer British television once thrived on. He didn't aim to be respectable, he aimed to be unforgettable. And for a long time, it worked. Through the 1970s and 1980s, he became a regular fixture on variety shows, panel programs, and comedy specials, known as much for his off-screen antics as for anything he did on stage. But when a career is built on excess, there's very little insulation when scrutiny arrives. Star's downfall didn't begin with a conviction. It began with attention. In the wake of the Jimmy Savile revelations, British police launched wide-ranging investigations into historical abuse allegations involving public figures. Star's name surfaced during that period, pulling him into Operation Yewtree, the same investigation that exposed just how deeply abuse had been buried within the entertainment industry. He was arrested, he was questioned, more than once. In the end, prosecutors said there wasn't enough evidence to charge him criminally, and in the eyes of the law, that should have been the end of the matter. It wasn't. Because criminal courts aren't the only places reputations are judged. In a separate case, Star attempted to clear his name by suing a woman who had publicly accused him of groping her when she was a teenager, backstage in the 1970s. The lawsuit was for libel. Star wanted vindication. What he got instead was devastation. The court ruled against him. The judge concluded that the woman's account was substantially true. No prison sentence followed. No criminal conviction. But legally, the ruling carried weight. It meant that in a court of law, under scrutiny, her allegations stood. That single verdict did more damage than any tabloid headline ever could. From that moment on, Star existed in a kind of permanent limbo, not convicted, not exonerated. A public figure legally associated with a finding that affirmed misconduct, even if it didn't cross the criminal threshold required for imprisonment. For someone whose brand depended on bravado, the collapse was brutal. Television stopped calling. Appearances dried up. Star left the UK and relocated to Spain, where he gave increasingly bitter interviews, claiming betrayal, conspiracies, and media vendettas. The man who once thrived on attention now seemed consumed by it. His final years were marked not by comedy, but by resentment and isolation. When he died in 2019, his passing was muted. Obituaries were brief, tributes restrained. The same tabloids that once splashed his antics across front pages quietly turned the page. What remains of Freddy Star's legacy is uncertainty. Not innocent, not guilt, but I doubt it. And doubt, once attached to a public figure, is almost impossible to erase. His story illustrates a deeply uncomfortable truth. Not every fall from grace ends in prison. Some end in something more ambiguous, a legal finding, a public stain, and a reputation that can never quite be defended again. Because sometimes, the verdict that matters most isn't handed down by a jury, it's handed down by time. John Bindon. John Bindon didn't just play violent men, he lived close enough to violence that the distinction eventually collapsed. Bindon's presence on screen was unmistakable. Thick-set, hard-eyed, and radiating menace, he became a staple of British crime cinema in the late 1960s and 1970s. Films like Get Carter and Performance didn't cast him because he could pretend to be dangerous. They cast him because he didn't have to pretend. Directors understood something instinctively. Bindon brought a reality most actors could only imitate. Off-screen, that reality followed him everywhere. Bindon is openly associated with London's criminal underworld. He socialized with gangsters. He boasted of friendships with the Cray twins. His reputation was less actor who plays heavies, and more heavy who happens to act. Stories about him circulated constantly, some exaggerated, some disturbingly consistent. Violence, intimidation, and unpredictability were part of his mythology, and he did little to correct it. In 1978, the myth turned into a courtroom case. Bindon was charged with the murder of gangster John Dark after a violent altercation. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who was far too comfortable with brutality, someone whose proximity to criminal life made the incident feel inevitable rather than accidental. Bindon claimed self-defense. The trial gripped the tabloids. This wasn't a celebrity scandal in the usual sense. It felt closer to organized crime bleeding into entertainment. The jury ultimately acquitted him. Legally, Bindon walked free. But the acquittal didn't restore his career. In fact, it quietly ended it. Studios backed away. Insurance companies refused to cover productions involving him. The directors stopped calling. The very authenticity that once made him valuable now made him radioactive. The industry had tolerated danger when it was stylized and contained on screen. It had no appetite for it when the danger followed actors off set and into real life. Bindon retreated into obscurity, his reputation frozen in a strange limbo, not guilty, yet never trusted again. He died in 1993, remembered less for his performances than for the unsettling question his life raised. Where does performance end and reality begin? Bindon's story isn't about hidden crimes or shocking revelations uncovered decades later. It's about visibility. About a man who never bothered to disguise how close he lived to violence, and how quickly the industry abandoned him once that violence could no longer be framed as harmless grit. His case exposes another uncomfortable truth. The entertainment world will tolerate darkness, as long as it stays fictional. Once it becomes real, even acquittal isn't enough to wash it away. Darren Nesbitt. Darren Nesbitt built an entire career on menace, sharp features, icy delivery, and a stare that could turn a line of dialogue into a threat. Casting directors didn't hire Nesbitt to make audiences comfortable. They hired him to make them uneasy. Nazi officers, corrupt officials, men with secrets. British television of the 1960s and 1970s had a specific role for him, and he filled it effortlessly. What unsettled people later wasn't that he played violent men. It was that, at one point, he was one. In 1973, Nesbitt's private life became public in a way that couldn't be reframed as eccentricity or misunderstood genius. He pleaded guilty to assaulting his wife after discovering she was having an affair. The charge was assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Not a rumor, no allegation. A criminal admission in court. The details reported at the time were disturbing, even by the looser standards of that era. Yet the response was muted. There was no career collapse, no industry-wide reckoning. Nesbitt paid a fine. The marriage ended. And then, quietly, the world moved on. That silence is the most revealing part of his story. In the early 1970s, domestic violence was often treated as a personal failing rather than a public offense, especially when the perpetrator was a respected man. The framing mattered. It wasn't violence. It was a domestic incident. It wasn't abuse. It was losing control. Language softened the act until it barely registered as something requiring consequence. Nesbitt continued to work, not with the same prominence, but steadily enough. He appeared in films and television for years afterward, his conviction relegated to a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. Audiences watched him play villains without knowing they'd already seen a real one step out of character. His case isn't remembered because it was extreme, it's remembered because it wasn't. It represents an era when violence against women could be legally acknowledged and culturally ignored at the same time. When a guilty plea didn't translate into professional exile. When the industry's moral calculus quietly decided that talent outweighed harm. Nesbitt's legacy sits uncomfortably in that space. Not monstrous enough to be infamous. Not innocent enough to be forgotten. A reminder that some scandals didn't explode. They were absorbed. And that absorption tells you more about the system than about the man. Because when violence becomes survivable for a career, it means the threshold for accountability was set dangerously high. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was never accused in a courtroom, never arrested, never charged. And yet, few figures on this list leave behind a trail that feels as emotionally destructive as his. Sellers didn't harm through crimes that could be neatly documented. He harmed through proximity, through volatility, through the slow erosion of the people who loved him. To the public, he was a miracle. Inspector Clouseau, Dr. Strangelove, Chance the Gardener. A man who could disappear into character so completely that audiences forgot there was a person underneath. That talent made him legendary. It also made him unreachable, even to himself. Off camera, Sellers was described by friends, partners, and biographers as emotionally erratic, manipulative, and often cruel. He cycled through relationships with alarming speed, leaving behind ex-wives and children who later spoke of emotional neglect, psychological control, and sudden, terrifying mood shifts. He could be charming in one breath and vicious in the next. Praise turned to punishment without warning. Affection was conditional. Stability was non-existent. One former partner described living with him as walking on a minefield. Another said he would emotionally withdraw for weeks, then return as if nothing had happened, demanding forgiveness without acknowledgement. His children, particularly his daughter Sarah, later spoke openly about years of estrangement and emotional damage that never fully healed. There were moments that crossed from unsettling into deeply disturbing. Sellers reportedly threatened to end his own life during arguments, only to abandon the threat moments later, leaving those around him shaken and powerless. These were not cries for help. They were acts of control, emotional weapons deployed to dominate a room, a relationship, a narrative. And the industry knew. Directors, producers, agents. They all knew Sellers was difficult. But difficult geniuses were tolerated, even indulged. His instability was reframed as artistic intensity. His cruelty softened into eccentricity. As long as the performances were delivered, the damage behind the scenes was treated as collateral. Unlike others on this list, Sellers never had a single moment of public reckoning. No headline collapse. No trial. No scandal that forced a pause. His behavior was dispersed over years, spread thin enough that no single incident demanded intervention. That made it easier to ignore and harder to confront. After his death, reassessments began. Biographies stripped away the myth of the lovable comic and revealed a man who often seemed empty when not performing. A man who didn't just play fractured characters, but lived as one. Someone whose ability to become anyone may have come at the cost of being someone. Peter Sellers isn't remembered as evil in the traditional sense, but his legacy forces an uncomfortable question. How much harm is acceptable when it doesn't leave bruises, police reports, or verdicts? Because laughter can drown out a lot. And when the audience is entertained, silence becomes complicity. And next, we move to a man whose violence was neither private nor subtle, a figure whose self-destruction was public, celebrated, and lethal in its own way. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed didn't hide his darkness. He carried it into pubs, onto sets, into interviews, and dared the world to flinch. While others on this list relied on secrecy or institutional silence, Reed built a persona so loud and volatile that it disguised the damage as charisma. He wasn't protected despite his behavior. He was protected because of it. Reed's talent was undeniable. On screen, he radiated danger, sexuality, and unpredictability. Directors cast him when they needed rawness that couldn't be faked. Films like Women in Love, The Devils, and later Gladiator proved he wasn't just a brute. He was a serious actor with range and intensity. But off-screen, that intensity metastasized into chaos. His drinking wasn't a rumor. It was a performance. Reed drank publicly, competitively, and destructively. He bragged about consuming absurd amounts of alcohol, turning self-harm into entertainment. Talk shows didn't challenge him. They laughed along. The press framed his binges as legendary antics rather than warning signs. Violence, verbal abuse, and physical altercations were written up as colorful footnotes in the mythology of the last great Hellraiser. But the reality was uglier. Crew members described sets disrupted by rage and intoxication. Co-stars feared his unpredictability. Hotel rooms were destroyed. Fights broke out. Relationships fractured. People were hurt, emotionally and physically, though few incidents ever reached a courtroom. Why would they? Settlements were quieter than scandals. Silence was cheaper than accountability. Reed's behavior crossed lines repeatedly, but the industry recalculated every time. Was he still bankable? Could he still deliver on camera? If the answer was yes, the damage didn't matter. His reputation became self-sustaining. The worse he behaved, the more authentic he seemed. Destruction became part of the brand. By the 1990s, the toll was visible. Roles dwindled. Insurance companies hesitated. Directors began weighing talent against risk. His body was breaking down under years of excess, but even that decline was treated as tragic romance rather than preventable collapse. In 1999, while filming Gladiator in Malta, Oliver Reed died after a drinking contest with sailors in a pub. He was 61. The headlines framed it as fitting, ironic, on brand, as if dying from the very thing that had consumed him was somehow poetic. That framing is the final indictment, because Oliver Reed didn't just destroy himself, he normalized destruction. He showed an industry that chaos could be profitable, that violence could be entertaining, that addiction could be aestheticized as masculinity. He wasn't evil in a calculated way. He was reckless in a way that institutions enabled until it killed him. And when people call him a legend, the question isn't whether they're wrong, it's what they're willing to excuse to keep the legend intact. Next, we move to a figure whose fall didn't come from excess or rumor, but from a courtroom, and an acquittal that still failed to save his reputation. William Roach. William Roach represented stability. For more than 50 years, he was Ken Barlow on Coronation Street, the longest-serving character in British television history. Viewers aged alongside him. Generations trusted him. His presence was so constant it felt permanent, like a fixture rather than a performance. That's why what happened next landed like an earthquake. In 2013, Roach was arrested and charged with multiple historical sexual offense allegations dating back to the 1960s and 1970s. The shock wasn't just the accusations themselves. It was who they were aimed at. Not a fallen rebel, not a chaotic outsider, but the embodiment of reliability. The man British television had quietly taught people to trust. The media response was immediate and ruthless. Headlines splashed his name across front pages. His image flipped overnight from comforting to suspicious. Coronation Street suspended him. Decades of legacy froze in place while the public waited for a verdict. The trial in 2014 was long, tense, and heavily scrutinized. When the jury returned its decision, Roach was acquitted on all counts. Not a technical dismissal. A full not guilty verdict. In the eyes of the law, the case was over. In the eyes of the public, it wasn't. Roach eventually returned to Coronation Street, but something had changed. Even with an acquittal, the accusation itself had rewritten the relationship between actor and audience. For some viewers, innocence restored trust. For others, doubt lingered permanently. The show went on, but the illusion had cracked. His case became a defining example of a modern paradox. What happens when someone is legally cleared but culturally scarred? When the justice system draws a line, but the public imagination refuses to respect it? Roach did nothing more to defend himself than stand trial. He didn't lash out. He didn't stand. He allowed the process to unfold. And still, the weight of suspicion never fully lifted. Because accusations once spoken don't disappear. They echo, especially when attached to a face that once felt like family. Unlike others on this list, Roach's story isn't about proven guilt or hidden crimes. It's about how fragile reputation becomes once the word trial enters the conversation. How decades of familiarity can be destabilized by the mere possibility of wrongdoing. His legacy now exists in two parallel versions. One where justice was served and truth upheld. Another where the shadow never quite leaves the frame. And that duality is uncomfortable, because it forces a harder question than conviction ever could. If innocence isn't enough to restore trust, what is? What makes these stories truly disturbing isn't just what these men did, it's how long it took for the truth to surface. Some were convicted, some were acquitted, some were never formally judged at all. But every name on this list forces the same uncomfortable realization. Fame doesn't just create admiration, it creates protection. And when institutions, audiences, and media all benefit from the illusion, the silence becomes part of the crime. Classic British television taught generations what to trust, who to admire, and what respect looked like. But behind that familiar glow, too many warnings were ignored, too many whispers dismissed, and too many victims left unheard. These weren't just personal failures, they were systemic ones. A reminder that nostalgia can be dangerous when it replaces accountability. This isn't about rewriting history, it's about finally looking at it honestly. Because if we only celebrate the performances and never question the people behind them, the cycle doesn't end. It just waits for the next generation. And that's why we tell these stories here. This is Silver Veil, where legends are examined, not worshipped, and where the truth matters more than comfort. If this video made you rethink even one familiar face, stay with us. There are more stories behind the curtain, and we're only just beginning.